Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Michelle Hurn is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out her first appearances on episode 80, 150, and 550 of Boundless Body Radio. Michelle Hurn, RD, is a registered and licensed dietitian with several years of experience as a clinical acute care dietitian, a lead dietitian in psychiatric care, and an outpatient dietitian. While practicing inpatient and outpatient care in the hospital setting, Michelle discovered a disheartening connection between the high carbohydrate, low fat, sugar and moderation nutrition guidelines that she was required to teach and the rapidly declining health of her patients. Michelle is the author of the book, The Dietitian's Dilemma. What would you do if your health was restored by doing the opposite of everything you were taught? Detailing how the current nutrition guidelines came into existence and advocating for a low carbohydrate, animal based way of eating as an option for individuals struggling with chronic diseases such as diabetes, mental disorders, eating disorders, sarcopenia, and heart disease. Michelle is also an incredible endurance athlete and has competed in and won several marathons and ultramarathons. You can find her on social media, primarily on Instagram at Run, Eat, Meet, Repeat. Michelle Hurn, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, it's a joy to have you. I'm so grateful we've been able to meet in person several times. One of my absolute favorite podcasting moments was learning that we had met before when you were working with, we were both working with different companies and we had
Yeah.
already met. But since then, we've been able to meet at a few different conferences. And I purposely used an older form of your introduction. If I used an updated form of your introduction, it would have been like 3 or 4 pages long. And I do have the other book that you
I-
wrote, your second book, right behind me, which is the Fox Family Food Fight, which I absolutely love. We talked a little bit about it last time. I had not read it at the time, but since I've been able to buy it, I was definitely sure to give it a rating and review. And it's so adorable. You did an amazing job with it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was fun to write a kid's book.
It's so awesome. Yeah, I'm a personal trainer, so obviously I can't even count to 12. So reading books with lots of words is just such a challenge. So on behalf of people like myself, we really appreciate the pace of the children's book. It was much easier to follow along, and the illustrations are great. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I've had people tell me they've got it and just put it like on their coffee table for guests. They're like, it's really simple for just basic nutrition stuff. So
That's awesome. What
appreciate
other feedback? What other feedback have you gotten about the book since it's come out? That would be a great way to kind of have like a conversation starter. Obviously it's meant for children, but has it been pretty eye-opening for adults as well?
Yeah, I had several people ask me if the villain in the story, Foolery, if he's supposed to represent either the pharmaceutical industry or the food industry, or and I say, yeah, absolutely. That's what we're trying to show, is just how easily, they're those things can kind of come in and warp your view. And but yeah, I've had people tell me that their kids really like it, that it's, one of our friends said, yeah, because there's a list in the back of Freddie's favorite foods, and like, oh, they got really excited about that. So because we especially as kids, we learn through like what we watch and what we read, and so it's the feedback's been really fun.
It's awesome. I love that. I am constantly impressed by kids and their level of discernment
Mhm.
and their ability to kind of stick with some of these dietary guidelines. Not that we want kids necessarily on any particular diet, but when kids learn that, sugar is not the best for them, ultra processed food is not the best for them, just so many more of them than I think a lot of people expect are able to walk away from it, doing so, with their parents' help, but largely on their own. And they seem to do a great job. And after a while, they don't tend to miss the crappy foods in their diets anymore. Have you noticed that as well with kids?
Yeah, my second oldest sister has two kids, and her son is a type 1 diabetic, and so they've been able to, obviously since he was very young, track his blood sugars. And their grandparents, my sister's husband's parents, have type 2 diabetes, and my 8-year-old niece asked me, like, Aunt Michelle, so Liam is her brother, has type 1. Liam just eats less carbohydrates, and that really helps his type 1. Wouldn't that help type 2? She's 8, and she's like, why why grandma eating so many carbohydrates? It's like, well, you're ahead of most dietitians, child. So yeah, it is really interesting to see that kids just, they don't have an agenda. They often don't have the history with food, because food is so much more than just macronutrients or whatever. We eat because we're sad. We have all these emotional ties, potentially dealing with trauma and other things. But kids seem to get it quickly, which is fun.
That's great. It reminds me of R.D. Dykman's kid, Dave, when he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. It just came out of his mouth like, oh, okay, so should I just not eat carbohydrates anymore? And they like laughed at him. It was like, oh, that's cute, little kid. But like the kids know. And once they switch over, like they feel great. They feel amazing. They thrive in sports. They thrive in school. Their energy's so much better. They sleep so much better. Acne goes away, all kinds of different stuff that you and I probably dealt with growing up. A lot of these kids realize that it's the food and they can step away from it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. And just being able to have kids like prioritize protein, making sure they're getting plenty of protein, they're actually eating, whole foods, real foods, they're avoiding, like you said, all the ultra processed stuff. Like it's such a huge step because we also know that the patterns that we start as young people are going to follow us, into adolescence, into adulthood. So kind of establishing and just getting it in their brains, like, this is what I eat that makes me feel good. This is going to keep me from being sick. And if they're into sports, this is going to help me with my sports. So yeah, I think sometimes we underestimate, like you said, just how smart kids are and just how like they get it so much more simply often than adults.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it gives me a little bit of hope for the future. I don't know how you're feeling these days, optimism or pessimism about the direction that we're going. Maybe that would be a good place to start. How do you feel like the low carbohydrate kind of message is getting out these days?
Oh gosh, I feel mixed. Part of me feels very optimistic as I see more people embracing low carbohydrate diets. I see more discussion and more studies around low carbohydrate diets. And then, of course, on the flip side, I guess the pessimism would be I don't necessarily see on, a policy level or even just, the standard of care, in hospitals and other settings changing, at least not for a while. Unfortunately, we're still kind of a quick fix society. So, illness is still going up statistically. We still have more people now with, obesity, type 2 diabetes, mental health disorders. That's still increasing every year. But at least the conversation is starting. I feel like when I first started this, several years ago in 2019, just even saying the word keto, people would be like, well, that's a fad. And now I feel like more people are really embracing like, hey, yeah, we have all these clinical studies. We have this research. We just, I work now with Dr. Mariel Glantz at Ona Health, and we had a patient in 71 days, so less than 3 months, their A1C went from 10 to 5.4. So it's like mind blowing, stuff that I was never taught as a dietitian through the internship and through, and you never see that when people are on insulin and, eating carbohydrates. So there are more opportunities, I feel like, for dietitians, which is encouraging to me. There's more opportunities and more advocacy for this way of eating, but still our overall health trajectory still isn't good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I kind of am with you with very mixed feelings about that kind of thing. So hopefully the message continues to get out. And like we mentioned in the introduction, you've been on our show several times and have shared your story, but it's been about 2 years since even the last time you were on the show. So I think it'd be nice to kind of go back and explain to the listener, who you are, how you found some of this stuff, and how your life changed for the better when you found the low carbohydrate diet.
Yeah. So my story, when I was 12, I was diagnosed with a very serious eating disorder. I was 5 feet tall and weighed 57.5 pounds. So I had severe anorexia. I was put into a inpatient setting. So for 2 months, I was put on the 24-hour tube feeding system and, kind of forced to eat the standard American diet. And tube feed ingredients back then, maltodextrin, canola oil, soy protein, corn syrup. So really highly processed ingredients. And interestingly, when I went into the internship, I did become weight restored. Tube feed ingredients were the same then. And I'm, I just turned 42. So we're talking like literally 30 years later, we still have these really poor nutrition ingredients. And I was told as a young person, like, hey, look, if you do recover from an eating disorder, this is going to be with you your whole life. You're going to deal with racing thoughts around food, anxiety, probably periods of depression. The treatment center that I went to, there were several women there who, this is my third time here. This is my fourth time here, just had relapsed. It's so common to relapse. And like I said, I became weight restored, but I did certainly struggle. I had severe anxiety, depression, dealt with suicidal ideation, self-injury. And I describe it as feeling like I was standing on the sidelines of my own life. Like I could watch people seem to be carefree and participate in life, but I was thinking about food, worrying about food, very anxious in social situations, worried about grades and financial things. And, but I wanted to become a dietitian because I knew food was powerful. And I just had this intuition there was something I was missing, like, is there a way of eating that will just help my brain chill out, And, going through the internship was a total disaster. Like we briefly talked about, we'd go into people's rooms that had type 2 diabetes. And my preceptor would say, okay, we're going to teach them to eat carbohydrates consistently throughout the day so we can dose them with insulin consistently throughout the day. And I would just ask questions. I'd say, well, if their blood sugar is high and carbohydrates raise their blood sugar, should we teach them to eat less carbohydrates? And I was kind of pegged as this like difficult dietetics student. Oh no, if they eat less carbohydrates and more fat and protein, they're going to have a heart disease. It's going to be this big problem. And, you're so young, you're just like, oh, okay, I guess I'm learning. I don't know. And it was just so interesting because when I became a dietitian, I just saw the revolving door sickness. People would come in pre-diabetes and pretty soon full-blown diabetes, and then amputations, infections, heart disease, and you become really jaded and really sad. At the same time, I became an athlete. I did several marathons, like you said, and I wanted to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon, and I was getting close to that time, but it just kind of felt like my performance was starting to not go as well. I started struggling running. I started having like cold sweats. And at this time, this was 2019, I reached out to several doctors, sports dietitians, and several sports dietitians told me I wasn't eating enough carbohydrates. At that point, I was eating about 350 to 400 grams of carbohydrates. And I'm laughing because it just seems like such an astronomical amount. But according to them, I wasn't eating enough. So I increased that to over 500 grams. And as you can imagine, that didn't go particularly well. I remember driving to work and I literally couldn't see. Like I just started sweating and I had to pull over. I was getting like, like almost like dizzy spots. And of course, now I understand that as, I had hypoglycemia. I was eating so many carbs. My body is just desperately trying to get it out of the bloodstream, was overproducing insulin. And even though I've been very lean, I don't think a lot of times we tie in, you wouldn't have looked at me and been like, man, she's metabolically unhealthy. I clearly wasn't processing glucose very well in my brain. Mental health issues run in my family. And, when I ended up deciding like, look, I can't do this anymore, I'm no longer going to be a runner, I embraced a ketogenic diet. I was scared because of all the things that I'd been told, like, oh, you're not going to have any energy, your heart's going to explode, blah. But within just a few weeks, my lifelong anxiety went from paralyzing to I felt calm. My muscles stopped hurting. Like my whole life changed. And that led me to diving into like, well, why? Why do I feel so much better? Why after decade and a half of dealing with these issues, is it so much better in weeks? And that's, what led to understanding how, ketogenic diets and low carbohydrate diets, how they allow your body and brain to run on an alternate fuel source. I was eating so much sugar and so much carbs all day, every day. And not even like, not unhealthy stuff. It's not like I was over here eating ice cream and cookies, but I was eating oatmeal and fruit and sweet potatoes. Then my body never had a chance to oxidize fat and my brain just wasn't working well. And so it became my mission to teach, like, how can I help people who are struggling? Because like we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, like our metabolic health of our nation is the worst it's ever been. They think statistically only 7% of us are metabolically healthy, meaning 93% of us either have prediabetes, diabetes, high blood pressure, PCOS, all kinds of different things. And it all comes down to insulin resistance. So if we can get off this high carb, blood sugar spike and crash train and stabilize our blood glucose by eating, the proteins, fats, vegetables, we can restore our health and often relatively quickly.
Yeah, that's amazing. No, that 7% number, whether that's, an overestimation and underestimation, I think if you just go out in public, you just see it everywhere. It's easy to spot, like just going to Costco, even looking around, you can see it all around you. And there's a few things I want to dive into as far as your own study goes. And one has emerged as one of my absolute favorite things to talk about on the show. We've talked about it quite a bit, even more in this last year as more research is being done. You've obviously done a case study about this, but eating disorders and metabolic therapies, we're getting more data around this, including, again, some of the case studies that you have published and other researchers out there. Can you tell us kind of some of the ideas around using metabolic therapies for things like eating disorders that might seem counterintuitive in the beginning?
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, like you were saying, for mental health, we're so fortunate that we have, the Bazooki group that's funding, studies on bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And basically, when you look at any type of mental health disorder, I like to link it to like epilepsy, right? Because epilepsy, babies are born with it. They're not, they didn't do anything wrong. They didn't have like a, bad diet in the mother's womb or whatever. But and all epilepsy is just a genetic abnormality in the brain where, when the individual or the child has glucose, the brain does not process glucose or sugar very well. So they have a seizure. And often what happens is you give the baby or the person a ketogenic diet. So now their brain is being fueled off free fatty acids and ketones, and they stop seizing. It's like that for whatever reason, their brains just don't metabolize glucose very well. It's like if you had a car and you put the wrong fuel in it, you wouldn't be shocked like, oh my God, it's not running. Well, yeah, it can't, you have to put the right fuel in. And so, like Dr. Sethi Shabani, she wrote a case study on, binge eating disorder. And what they were finding is when they took people off the standard American diet, took people off the, eat whatever you want, sugar in moderation, and put them on these low carbohydrate diets, they did incredibly well. And like you said, it's almost blasphemy in the dietetics world to say, hey, you have an eating disorder, you have a unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship with food, but we're going to restrict this food group. Because on the surface, it sounds like, oh my God, no, you can't do that. You can't restrict somebody with binge eating disorder, certainly anorexia, they're really underweight. You can't tell them not to eat carbohydrates or not to eat a food group. But as opposed to looking at it like that, well, how we have looked at it, and I think what's been really successful, is we look at it, how does this impact my hormones? Like how does protein, how does meat, how do eggs impact my hormones? How does oatmeal, cereals, bread, how does that impact my hormones? Canola oil, coconut oil, butter, how do those things? When you look at it like that, if you have a particular food group that has an incredibly negative impact on your, hormones, and specifically looking here at like insulin, why would you consume that? Why would you consume something that is directly causing a negative impact on blood glucose and insulin, not allowing your brain to function, and potentially exacerbating your disease? Because if you just took it out like that, people would be like, oh, of course, I would never want to eat something like that. But what we found is that often, just like we talked about a second ago, people are eating so many carbohydrates throughout the day. And even people who are under eating, who come from a background of anorexia, often their hunger signals are completely out of whack and their body is overproducing insulin. They're trying to get whatever nutrition they consume into the bloodstream quickly. And so for those people eating a lot of, cereals and granola bars and carbohydrates, they can feel, almost euphoric initially and then crash really hard. And that's a scary feeling. One, of course I've been there. And two, that's really not a good long-term sustainable solution, even from like a health and, macronutrient, proteins, vitamin and mineral wise. So yeah, the paper that I wrote, we just looked at 3 people who had very long periods. We're talking like over, 10 years of recovery and from an eating disorder, and living and eating a ketogenic or carnivore diet. So a very high fat, high protein, and very low carbohydrate diet. And they reported, they gain weight, they feel strong, they're mentally stable. And that certainly isn't me here saying like, oh my gosh, everyone with an eating disorder has to follow a ketogenic or carnivore diet. I often work with people who we use that as a tool to really help heal your metabolism. Like, let's stabilize your blood glucose. Let's, get you to where you can oxidize fatty acids. And then from there, they often will build their diet out because, I'm not anti-carbohydrate. A lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, but metabolically healthy people can tolerate, carbohydrates. It depends on your life and your goals. But, our current system is just awful. We take people who are either in periods of severe starvation or have been binging and purging, and we throw just unlimited amounts of sugar and things to them. And then we're surprised when their body and brain are on fire. So yeah, that's kind of what the research, is showing, that just get the blood sugar stable, let the body and brain run on both, be able to be metabolically flexible where they can run on both fat and ketones. And then that also helps, the brain function.
Wow. One of our former guests, Carolyn Beckwith, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, her story. She really opened my eyes to kind of what the treatment is actually like when you go to these inpatient or outpatient centers. How it's exactly what you mentioned. Like, the people that you knew in those treatment centers, they could have been there their second time, their third time, their fourth time. Like, people are relapsing, and the kind of counseling that you're given, as far as I understand it, is you're trying to be accepting of all foods. Like if you have a, somewhat of an orthorexic view of food, and you are not never going to eat cookies, you're supposed to like hold the cookie and smell the cookie and taste the cookie and that kind of thing. And it just, the failure rate of treatment seems to be absolutely terrible in the conventional system. And that sounds like somewhat of what you experience, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Like there's a fantastic article written about specifically about anorexia that talked about how it was called a crisis in care, and how people would go into treatment, gain weight rapidly, come out of treatment, lose weight rapidly, go back into treatment, and the cycle would continue. And they said these people are getting sicker, because obviously that affects your bones and muscles. It's fine. It financially, it bankrupts you. It bankrupts families. It certainly caused my family a lot of financial distress. And then you just feel like you're a failure. It mentally destroys you. Where in reality, like you said, you're potentially feeding people these substances their bodies just can't tolerate. Once again, if you put diesel fuel in your regular car and you're just like, I can't believe it's not working, it's like, no, just put the right fuel in and it will work very well. But our current nutrition guidelines insist that we have to feed people these very high carbohydrate diets. And like you said, with the cookie thing, is ridiculous. I specifically remember when I was 12, that was actually the last year, that this is in the 90s, that the facility I was at, we had both adults and children. Now all facilities legally are separated. So, it wasn't uncommon to be in therapy sessions with someone much older, or, group things. And I remember we were going into one of those really goofy, oh, it's a challenge, everybody's going to eat a cookie. And I remember one of the adults like grabbed me and she was like, when they ask you if you're anxious, you say no. Do you understand me? I was like, why? They're like, say no, say you're happy, she was like, we all want to get the fuck out of here. So it was like, you need to lie so everyone thinks you're okay. So
Wow.
it's like, I mean, this is, it's funny what now as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, so inappropriate to do to a child. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of, from what I understand, it's very similar as far as, forcing people to eat these highly processed, high sugar foods and pretend that everything's fine.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so this is going to be purely speculative to ask you to time travel back to where you were, 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. If somebody knew about this kind of stuff and presented this as an option, again, a lot of moving parts, pure speculation. Part of this has to do with, your family and what they were choosing to eat. You don't have full autonomy. But if somebody told you you could have walked away from your eating disorder by eating a stricter, call it a ketogenic diet or metabolic, therapeutic kind of a diet, do you think you would have accepted that, or at least been willing to try?
Oh, 100%. Because
100%.
I specifically like being in like the year after, because after I got out of treatment, did okay for a little bit, then lost quite a bit of weight. And I remember being in a therapist's office and just crying and saying, I will eat whatever you tell me to. I just don't want to feel so bad. Because I would go a few hours through the day and just like start to sweat and get shaky. Because once again, my body was so insulin. It would be my hypothesis, my insulin was high. I would crash really hard. Where, when I wouldn't eat, I didn't. I was just, once again, I wasn't taking in sugar, so my blood sugar was stable. But if someone had said, hey, we can do the same thing, you can have stable blood sugar, your anxiety is going to be better, you're just going to eat a lot of protein and fat. And of course, I know I still had lots of fears around meat and fat. That certainly isn't uncommon for people with eating disorders. But I think if somebody had said, I'm going to explain it to you and let's just experience it for a few days, I absolutely would have been in on that. And I think most people would.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, the numbers, it's really scary with anorexia in particular, how many people don't survive. I know you wrote about that in your book and shared a beautiful poem of somebody who didn't make it out. And you yourself were given, I believe it was like a 10% chance that you'd even make it out. Like those are really scary numbers. And I don't even know if it's something you will ever like walk away from fully in your life, but it seems much more manageable for a lot of people when they address it with the diet and run their brains on ketones,
I agree. Yeah, 1,000%. And yeah, the statistics are horrible. And I mean, and I often think when I see statistics, I'm like, it's probably even worse than that. It's probably worse than what we think. But it right now, it's about 20% of people with anorexia don't survive. And then, it was like another 20 to 25% are going to be in and out of the hospital their whole life, doing that, get a little better, lose weight. And then there's a pretty high percentage of suicide. It just start to feel hopeless and helpless. It's like you're doing everything that you're supposed to do Yet, you feel miserable, you feel sick and scared, and your brain is running a million miles an hour. It makes it very hard to hold down a job, to have any type of social life. So yeah, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, wow. I recently listened to an interview, I believe it was the Metabolic Link podcast hosted by Don D'Agostino, where he hosted Lane Norton and Dr. Richard Johnson, who is a researcher focused primarily for most of his career on fructose. And they were, kind of having a debate back and forth about, how people can lose weight if you can do it on a low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate diet. And of course, Lane Norton is, all about energy balance and trying to control that. And they're talking about weight control, weight loss, those types of things. And it's so interesting to me how easy it is to get wrapped up in the conversation of weight loss, weight control, and saying like you can do this on a low carbohydrate or a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And I agree. I think you can. But there's all these other things that people miss that they're not really talking about. Like, yes, you can control your weight on a low fat diet, but what about your mental state? What about the thing about eating disorders? And I want to talk to you about your endurance racing as well. Like there's so many other things that people miss where I look at your story in 2019 and how many things improved for you all at once. Like again, you started running again, your endurance got a lot better, your mental health was one of the first things you said, like your relationship was much better with your wife, who almost didn't even let you do the diet, by the way, which is fully justified. I would be freaked out too, knowing what she would have known at the time. So it's just I think we miss so often the true healing power of eating the proper way and the number of things that really gets fixed that are not just weight control and weight loss.
Yeah, and I appreciate too that you made the point, because I think we have to be very careful never to be dogmatic. I'm always, and I will say this still the day I die. Hopefully, I'm open to growing and evolving and learning, and I mean that's part of science. Is we hopefully we continue to know more and to learn more and to grow more. And yeah, working in the hospital. I mean, I became a dietitian in 2009, and the low fat, high carbohydrate diets are that's what people do, or that's what people are taught to do. And that's what people really try to do. I don't think there was a single patient. Oh, well, there's rare exceptions, but most people really want to get better, really are focused in, I'm going to follow this. And they find themselves chronically hungry. They find themselves tired. They find themselves achy. They can't sleep. Like you said, all these issues that are directly tied to poor metabolic health. And can you lose weight on a high carb, low fat diet? Absolutely. I mean, you can lose weight doing all kinds of different things. I think there was a guy who just ate chicken nuggets and ended up losing weight due to a calorie deficit. Of course, he had lots of other metabolic problems from that. But like you said, it's our goal, and most people's goal, one, isn't just to lose weight. If you're overweight, you want to lose fat. And so we have to be able to control insulin. Insulin is the fat storage or fat burning hormone. And certainly by getting carbohydrates down, you're going to be able to control insulin. Even on I've had patients I've worked with that were eating as low as 1,200 calories and could not lose weight. And then you get them on 1,500 to 1,800 calories, but we really switch it to where we get their insulin low, meaning we're wiping out most of the carbs. We're switching, instead of having oatmeal for breakfast, they're having eggs. Instead of having a sandwich, they're having, a salad with chicken and oil. And they're able to lose weight. So it isn't just a calories thing. It's really, once again, going back to, we're looking at hormones.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Let's talk about the endurance sport thing. If somebody had never heard of, the term fat adaptation, we know we go to endurance events and all you see is carbohydrates everywhere, like sugary. You need the Gatorade, you need the goo, like everybody's using it. You see it in, the documentaries about the Tour de France and how they're consuming super high amounts of carbohydrates. So no fault of anybody who gets into endurance sport, even as a weekend warrior, and you just inherently know that you need to run on those things. If I had never heard of fat adaptation, how would you explain that to me? And what has been your experience as you started to switch over the diet as far as like the endurance sport went?
Yeah. So how I like to start to explain it is, it doesn't matter if you are a high carbohydrate or a low carbohydrate athlete. Like our ultimate goal is to be able to defend muscle glycogen. Like you don't want to burn through your muscle and liver glycogen. If anybody has ever run a marathon or done a really long endurance event, it is very possible to hit the wall. Meaning, you're running a really good, and all of a sudden your body just locks up. Like you've literally you've burned through all your carbohydrate stores. And our body has the ability to burn, different fuel substrates, either carbohydrates or fat. And most people consume so many carbohydrates, throughout the day. They're eating carbohydrates for breakfast, for lunch, for snack. They're using carbohydrates before they run, during their run, after they run, every day, that they become very efficient at burning carbohydrates, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe let's say this person's a lean endurance athlete. On the flip side, when you follow a lower carbohydrate diet, and then you do, some runs fasting, all of a sudden you are teaching your body to burn your own fat for fuel. And it doesn't matter if you are 5% body fat, super lean. We all have plenty of stored body fat. I shouldn't say never. You're unlikely to run out of stored body fat. I mean, you have enough for like 10 marathons back to back to back to back. I mean, you'd have muscle fatigue and other things. But by teaching our body to use more fat for fuel, one, I have found out it's overwhelmingly less inflammatory. Like, I'm able to train and recover significantly better now that I, follow this way of eating versus when I was a much higher carbohydrate diet human. And because I oxidize so much fat, you're basically training yourself to be able to oxidize fat to at higher heart rates and faster paces. Because we do know, like, the higher heart rate you go, the more you're going to, burn through carbohydrates. So when you are a low carbohydrate athlete training, you're able, like I said, to oxidize just really high amounts of fat. Why does that matter and why is that beneficial? Like you said, when you go to races, every single human is eating before, doing, goos and gels and all this stuff during. And interestingly, statistically, a lot of people drop out of these ultra marathons and, long triathlons because of GI issues. It's like their stomach.
Right.
They get nauseous or their leg, they start hurting. Oh crap. I shared with you before we started recording that I just did a race, 6-hour race, and it was hot. Several people called it like, I'm done. It was in the 90s. And we're actually on the starting line. And this guy was like eating bananas on the starting line. I'm like, oh no, bro, you like literally are suppressing fat oxidation. And if you do that, if you're having lots of carbohydrates before activity, you're getting an insulin response. And when you get an insulin response, your ability to oxidize fat falls off a cliff. It's not like, oh, all of a sudden I can't oxidize as much fat. It's like, literally, you can see, I can send you the science graph. This is actually a really good one. And so if you don't consume carbohydrates every 20 to 30 minutes, you're gonna start to suffer through the race because you're literally not able to oxidize your body's fat. So I feel like I talked like, I don't know if I explained that very well, but ideally what we want to do is always say we want to start activity without an insulin response. Then if you've been practicing a lower carbohydrate diet, now you're using carbohydrates specifically and strategically to defend muscle glycogen. Because I do take in carbohydrates, but as opposed to taking, God, people are taking astronomical amounts now, 100 grams an hour, 150 grams an hour. I'm very comfortable between about 25 and 30 grams an hour. And so I feel fueled, I feel great. And guess what? When someone's over there puking all the goo because they've I have much less risk of having GI issues. So, and I've also, like I said, probably the biggest thing are the energy and recovery. Like, I used to do an 18 to 20 mile run as a marathon runner on a very high carb diet. And I was just wiped out, like, for the day, sometimes for the weekend. And now, that's what I do. That's Friday, and then Saturday I'm going to come back and run hard again. So.
Wow. Well, my first introduction into the low carbohydrate, kind of higher fat space was an endurance coach named Bob Siebehar in Colorado that did a call with us that explained, like, he had his triathletes eating, 50, 60 calories an hour, and they were not bonking, which I was like, how can you even do that? And the kind of testing that I was doing with that company before, and we were measuring the oxidation rates in different zones. And so you think about, like, if somebody is trained to burn more carbohydrate, they could be running their race pace, burning, say, 80% of their calories from carbohydrates. And, maybe if they're burning, 1,000 calories an hour doing that, and 800 of those calories are coming from carbohydrates, it's just a really quick calculation to understand, like, where is that potential drop off going to be? Exactly what you described, like hitting the wall, dropping off. Like, one of the pages on the report that we would give would show people their storage capacity for both carbohydrates and for fat. And for women, the number would be about 1,500 calories of carbohydrate that they could store. For men, it would be a little bit more like 2,000 because of a little bit more muscle mass. But explaining to people that this is the top limit. You don't store more than just this. This is the most. Like, you thinking that you're eating a bunch of pasta and sandwiches before an event the night before, you're not going to get like 3,000 calories stored of carbohydrate. Anything that exceeds that gets stored as fat. And like you said, when you're burning and consuming so much carbohydrate, the insulin is suppressing the fat burn. And the next number that we would show is how much fat calories you have stored up in the body. And if the listener, if somebody listening is not watching, they're not seeing you, you are incredibly lean. You're very, very fit. Even your weight and body fat percentage, you still would have tens of thousands of calories of fat available. And for somebody who's overweight, obese, that number gets up to 300, 400, 500,000 calories. And it's such a shame, because it's like you said earlier, these are the people that want to lose fat, they want it gone, they'll do anything. And it's the hormones, like you explained, it's the insulin that's making them not even be able to access this vast amount of energy that's there waiting to be burned, ready, willing, and able to be burned. And it's just is in that situation, can't be burned.
It's the mystery of the fat marathon runner. It's like, you should know how. I used to really ponder, like, how can there be people training 50, 60 miles a week that are overweight? How is this possible if it's just calories in, calories out? But like you just said so eloquently, it's not. It's insulin. You can be, if you're taking in calories and they're all from those carbohydrates and sugar, you are literally preventing. You have tons. These people are overweight. They have excess body fat, but you're literally teaching your body not to touch it, not to burn it, only to burn the sugar that you drink. And then, you're done running, you're going to be hungry. So you eat more carbohydrates. And if your store is already filled up, then that gets stored as fat. So, I've actually had people, known to people who've trained for marathons who gained weight because they were eating so many carbohydrates and probably already had a, higher insulin. So yeah. So just like so many disease states, we can just get insulin down. And how do you do that? You have to reduce, and in some cases, depending on how metabolically sick you are, even eliminate carbohydrates.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe this is a very obvious question, but as we were talking about earlier, low carbohydrate ketogenic diets are helpful for many, many different things. Carbohydrates, like you said, are not evil. We're not anti-carbohydrates, just that most people are consuming way too much. I still consider what you're saying on a high carbohydrate load day on a race weekend, 150 grams of carbohydrate. That to me still counts as a low carbohydrate diet, especially given how active you are. How do you help people ride the line between, I want to take advantage of performance and I want to use carbohydrates strategically, but also I want to make sure that I'm maintaining my mental health. I'm getting all the other health benefits. So like we listed earlier, I want to make sure my GI is okay. How do you kind of ride that line of like introducing carbohydrates, or the particular carbohydrates that you enjoy? Like, how do you kind of balance those two things out?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because that often people are very afraid to add carbohydrates back in. I have people reach out to me that are like, "Oh, I'm doing this event, but I've been carnivore, keto, and my body, I feel good, my mind feels good, but my athletic performance isn't where I want it to be." And so often, kind of like we were talking about earlier, using them in a way that is not going to impact, mental. You're really not going to get an insulin response, or too much of an insulin response. You're going to get some. And so, that's a little bit different, kind of depending on the person. But specifically, if they're an athlete, using that around activity, like often if they're doing a training session in the morning, they'll perhaps do that, fasted. If it's super long, then they might wait, till about 40 to 45 minutes into training before they introduce some carbs. But I often find people are able to do, carbohydrates post exercise, with that post exercise meal. And that's another thing. I don't, I don't think you need to finish a 30-minute workout, or even, a hour workout, and chug some type of maltodextrin or Gatorade, or, that's all commercial silliness. If you just go into your next meal, have protein, have some fat, healthy fats, and then, having a serving of carbohydrates with that, you're not going to get that huge blood sugar response. And then, depending on how heavy your training load is, I often will have people have a dose of carbohydrates in the evening, because they're going to be training hard in the morning. Always, though, within the context of a meal, just to avoid any type of issues. And as far as what type goes, I just lean people into unprocessed carbohydrates. Our carbohydrate sources today, especially like fruits, and they look nothing like, they have more sugar and more other things than we've had in the past. But I would say, find something you like, find something your body tolerates. I think everybody's a little different. And because it tends to be such a small part of the person's diet, if they're following a lower carbohydrate diet, I haven't really found that there's like a, a magical carb. I do some long fermented sourdough my wife makes. Sometimes we do little, berries in the summer. White rice potentially after like a hard training session with my protein and fat.
Yeah. Okay. And then, as you mentioned, since the quantity is going to be very low, I'm assuming things like, somebody's doing potatoes, sweet potatoes,
Mhm.
oxalate would not really be a huge concern for you because the amount is just so low to not really present a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's also very specific. Some people are like, if like, man, I've had a huge issue with oxalates, or I've had a huge issue with some other type of anti-nutrient, then I just say, yeah, just avoid that. Like for example, some people nightshades, they get achy reactive. Some people are like, gosh, I've spinach, chard, some of those vegetables, higher in oxalates, they have issues. But in general, I think this is where you kind of have to use your own intuition. Like, yeah, I've always eaten white potatoes. I've never had a problem. Or I've always eaten rice. I've never had a problem. It's like, yeah, that's probably fine for you to use in context.
Gotcha. Okay. So for somebody who's listening to this and they're thinking like, yeah, I'm bonking in every race. Maybe I'm not winning my half marathons, but I'd at least like to finish or improve my
Mhm.
time. Eating this certain way sounds really great. What would you want somebody to know about transitioning over, the timing in their season, things to watch
Yeah.
out for in the beginning? Like how do you help people transition into a low carbohydrate diet for performance reasons? Again, more like the weekend warrior level.
Yeah, I think you have to give it time. Your body is not going to go from oxidizing, 90% carbohydrates to being able to oxidize fat in like 2 or 3 days. And that's often what people do is they'll eat a very low carb diet for a few days and go for a run and feel miserable, and like, oh, this stuff doesn't work. So it takes time. And I also would encourage people to do it like in an off season or a very low volume season, to where meaning you're not doing a whole lot of fast workouts, you're not running or whatever endurance activity you're doing. It's not hours and hours. It's also ideally a good thing to do if you can do it around a time of less stress. Like, it may not be ideal to do if you're moving or about to get divorced or whatever. So if you can do it in a season of your life, but you can actually start to oxidize, you can see a shift within 30 days and certainly within 3 months. I think that's what they used to do at the company you work for, is 90 days. You can see pretty dramatic shifts to where people can go from oxidizing only 20% fat to being able to oxidize 60 to 80% fat following that lower carbohydrate diet. So, and just being aware, when you transition from eating very high carb to low carb, you're often going to experience some of that, what they call like the keto flu, the kind of low energy, a little bit like achy. You just want to make sure you're drinking plenty of fluids, lots of electrolytes. Because once you get past that point, it's like magic. I just love how I can feel just so good and consistent. I'm never worried. I used to, if I didn't have like, Recoverite, some type of maltodextrin whey protein right after I ran, I'd get dizzy, shaky. If I didn't have a goo at 8 miles, and now, I mean, I can run 20 miles fasted. I'm totally fine.
Yeah, yeah. It makes my stomach hurt just to think about the maltodextrin, like all the Cytomax I've consumed in
Yeah.
my life. Just like,
Yeah.
oh,
I don't like
gross. Can't do it. And yeah, the electrolyte thing is real. I think both of us have been in situations where we didn't stay up enough on electrolytes, and you can get yourself into a really dark place on a low carbohydrate diet if you are either consuming too much water and not enough electrolyte. You can get into a really, really bad spot with if
Yeah.
you're not keeping up on that.
Yeah. The body needs salt, and it needs salt badly, especially because what's happening is your insulin level is coming down. You're not eating as much carbohydrates, or you may be completely eliminating them. And so, your kidneys are going to be like, oh my God, and like hold on to salt. And so, you got to make sure you're taking in enough salt, or you're going to feel achy headaches, all kinds of stuff. So salt, sodium, potassium, and there's so many good powdered electrolytes and things you can use. But yeah, I would definitely say that first week. If I could go back and redo my transition, I would hammer the electrolytes.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you for explaining that. I really appreciate that. And I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You are working with, I love her. She's amazing. Maria Glant,
Yes.
doing amazing work. Tell us how that came about and what your work is with her.
Yeah. So one of my dietitian friends asked me actually if I was familiar with Ona Health. And I said no. Tell me more. And I was familiar with Dr. Glant. I had seen Nina Teichel's article on what she was doing. And she explained to me that it's like, yeah, she has something called Ona Health. It's very similar to Virta Health, to where, you have people with type 2 diabetes, and the ultimate goal is remission. It's not like, let's just manage you. Because unfortunately, I mean, our current system really is like, someone may have type 2 diabetes, they'll see an endocrinologist, they prescribe them all these meds, The dietitian gives them a handout, tells them to eat carbs in moderation, and see ya in 6 months. And as you can imagine, that doesn't go particularly well. You're not giving people tools and skills and actually educating them. And so Mariella gets people off drugs. Often they're going in, tons of medication. So her goal is like, what do you not need to be on? Okay, and sometimes people still have to be on a few medications, but then she will educate them on the low carbohydrate diet. And then immediately within several days, they get a video call with me or one of the dietitians, and we will really dive into it. What are you eating now? What's going to make sense for you in your life? They get a very simple handout: eat these, don't eat these. And then every day they message us through an app. This is what I have for breakfast. This is what I have for lunch. This is what I have for dinner. And so they have that accountability. And we found just like the success rate is so high because we can see it right away. Like if, often, for example, a newer patient messaged me and like, I had a salad, but she took a picture of it and there's like fried chicken on it. It's like, oh, hey, breading has carbs. Oh, I didn't know that, So what if no one had ever told her? She thinks she's doing a great job, but she's loading up. Or beans is another one. Plantains are the bane of my existence. For whatever reason, people think plantains are good for you and don't have carbs. So, and once again, when you're type 2 diabetic, you have a carbohydrate intolerance. So we are really getting people no carbs, very, very low carbs. And so, yeah, it's been so much fun because, when I worked in the hospital, you couldn't teach this. And so now to have an opportunity where every day I get to see patients and get to see them get excited about feeling better. I've had people tell me like, yeah, my doctor told me I was going to be blind by the time I was 40, because their blood sugar is so high and they're just maxed out on meds. And to be able to say like, nobody told me, I just needed to stop eating carbs. And so it's sad, but it's also really cool to see just how effective this way of eating can be in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I was going to ask you about the compliance percentage and your success rate, which you've already mentioned. And it's fair to say also that a lot of these people don't have the most resources. Is that correct? Doesn't she work in an area where like people don't just have endless amounts of money?
It's humbling how, I think you said it very PC. Very poor people, unfortunately. And, but it often, there's a thought like, oh, we have to teach patients or we have to give patients insulin because they're just going to eat whatever they want or they can't afford it. But when the people that are motivated, and it's not perfect, we certainly don't have like 100% compliance rate, but it is actually very high. I was surprised. I had a woman once too. She told me, she's like, yeah, my food stamps ran out but I'm going to get on the bus and go to the food pantry. And they should have some canned chicken. It's like, this is what we're dealing with. Like people that are like, I'm going to do this. I will not fail. And the people that have that attitude, like, have blown me away. And it's just humbling because it's like, often people, some of my personal clients that I work with that have a lot more resources, sometimes they're just like, I don't know, where it's just like, these people are just so grateful for an opportunity. Like, wow, nobody taught me this. And you guys are doing this for me and supporting me. So I'm going to do this. I want to do this. And it's that attitude, because to be successful, you need to know what is the right thing to do, right? You have to dial the food in, but you also have to, in your mind, say, I refuse to fail. This is going to be very, very hard because it's not easy. Everywhere we go, we are bombarded with, cookies and crackers and donuts and sugary stuff and sugary beverages. And our family and friends want to give them to us. And they give us a dopamine hit. They make us feel good. It's cultural. It's this, it's that. So we're asking this, this group of people like, hey, I need you to abandon that. Especially culturally, like a lot of people, we were a lot of Hispanics, a lot of people from the Caribbean. It's like beans and rice. And like I said, plantains. That's what they do. That's all they eat. Often these people have the lowest blood urea nitrogen levels I've ever seen, which is a measure tends to be, the breakdown of protein. I'm like, oh my God, are you eating any protein? Yeah. So really low PU and really high blood glucose. So to me, that's like, okay, we need more protein and a lot less carbohydrates. But it's cool because this is the first time in my professional career I've been able to actually work for a company and teach low carb nutrition. It's always been just having to work for myself because I couldn't work in a larger hospital institution.
Yeah. No, that is amazing. And you think about all the things we talked about earlier, and like your energy is going to improve. You're probably going to be able to do some intermittent fasting, which means now you're not eating as much. Your cost is going down for all these foods since you're not spending lots of money on soda and the ultra processed crap that's getting more and more expensive, and the quantities are getting lower and lower. Like, to think about all those side benefits for somebody who, maybe wants to go work extra hours. They need an extra job. They want to save some money. Like, all of those side benefits, the mental clarity, all that stuff is helping them along the way, which is fantastic. So it's so cool that you've been able to find an actual company to be able to work for where you can offer that. And then another piece of news that happened since the last time we talked, I have to be honest with you, I'm sure you get this all the time, but when I heard this news, I was like, Michelle sold out. There it is. She sold out to the devil. She joined the American Diabetes Society. These
Oh.
guys are putting out the worst information. I see their recipes are terrible. The advice they give, that stupid video that came out on Twitter like last year with the dietitian recommending that people with diabetes eat, at least half or 3/4 of their plate with, carbohydrates. And then I realized, oh, she said society. She didn't say association. Never mind. She didn't sell out. Can you tell us about the
We
American
get people
Diabetes?
really mad. That's so funny because I do get people messaging me.
That was my first
We
thought
hate
for
the
sure. And I was like, oh,
association.
wait.
They're terrible, and I'm like, we're not these. I was telling Ken, I was like, maybe, I was telling Dr. Barry, I was like, maybe we should have picked a vastly different name than that.
I like it. I hope it steals clicks, frankly. I hope somebody's punching it in and it's like, oh, here it is. And then they, without even knowing, get really great advice from some amazing people versus the association.
Yeah, I mean, our goal is to be the opposite because the association, I mean, their slogan is connected for life. Their recipes are high carbohydrate. Their dietitian advice is high carbohydrate, which for a type 2 diabetic is guaranteed to make you connected for life, is going to keep you sick. Where in the American Diabetes Society, we've been really fortunate. So it's myself, there's 3 other dietitians, Shannon Davis, Temple Stewart, and Shanna Hesson. And then just some brilliant doctors. We have Tony Hampton, Eric Westman, Ben Bickman, Mariella Glantz on there, and then Kim Berry. Our goal is to help people reverse type 2 diabetes, and mostly, teaching people that you can do that. It's not well known, even in the medical community. It seems so, of course, to us because we're in this space, but a lot of people, I had patients when I worked in acute care that were diabetic for decades. Like, they just didn't know. They just kept eating carbs, insulin, eating carbs, insulin. And then it's like, oh, my teeth are falling out. Oh, I'm, kidney failure. It doesn't have to be that way. Like I said earlier, we had a patient reverse his type 2 diabetes in less than 3 months. But we do have to teach people how to eat, getting off the carbohydrates, focusing on the protein and fat, teaching people that fat is not bad for you. It's not going to cause your heart to explode, So yeah, our first year has been fun. It's just mostly been fundraising, starting to have a plan and a vision for what we want to do. We are planning to have a virtual event in the fall, and then our first in-person event next year. So it's just, there's a lot of moving parts. It's challenging because we all are doing this on a volunteer basis. So it's hard to get everybody together. But our social media is growing. It's been really exciting to get more posts out there and just get more people excited about being healthy.
That's amazing. I mean, those names that you listed, that's like the who's who of all the most amazing people in our community, including you. So that must be a joy, again, as a volunteer. Definitely a challenge, but I think it's really cool that you're involved with that. And hopefully that's, again, stealing some clicks from the association. And if nothing else, like just going to the website and seeing some of the recipes, it's just like so vastly different than what you would see on the American Diabetes Association. And the things that they recommend as far as recipes, they're just embarrassing at this point. Like, it is so bad. Like there's sugar in so many of their recipes. They're very high carbohydrate that get connected for life slogan. I was not aware of that. And yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's embarrassing. It's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, I got destroyed on social media for suggesting that as a dietitian for a major, association like that, you should be I said she should be metabolically healthy, and she's, obese, and people said, oh, I'm fat phobic and I'm a terrible person. It's just like, well, sorry. The whole thing is silly, but they have, they're heavily sponsored too by several pharmaceutical companies that also create type 2 diabetes drugs, which seems a little conflict of interest to me, but what do I know? But of course, because of that, they have so much money, they have so much advertising budget and money where, our group, we are committed. We're not taking any financial donations from, any any potential conflicts of interest. So of course there will be no processed foods or pharmaceuticals. but we would rather do that. We'd rather grow the right way, because when you do have sponsors, you have a fiduciary responsibility to not say things against them, so it's like we get to say what actually works. We're not bound by anything. We're wanting to educate people. This is what the science says, and we genuinely want to help people reverse their type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you just mentioned in-person events. You just got back from the low carbohydrate cruise. How was that?
It was fantastic. I've never been to Alaska before, so that was really cool. What a cool experience. And there were several doctors and other people in the low carbohydrate space that got to present. Dr. Tro, Dr. Lensk, and just having community too, because when you're on a cruise, you're with everybody for quite a bit of the time. So yeah, I feel really blessed that I got to do that. Grant and I really enjoyed that.
So on a cruise like that, you're obviously not taking the whole ship, or it's just part of it, and like you have like meeting rooms and that kind of thing. So you're hanging out together. Do they cater to low carbohydrate menus and that kind of thing?
No, I think that'd be cool if they did. Oh, that was, and of course, whenever you're eating, you can make your own choices. But I think, especially if you're like newer to low carb, I think it would have been kind of cool if, some of the places had like, this is the low carb section, or this is the, low carb menu. Because no, you're unfortunately exposed to lots of just the normal cruise fare.
Yeah. So can you out anybody big in our space that was like you caught him like eating a cake or something?
Yeah, no, and I honestly don't think I did, but no, I wouldn't if I did.
I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me that they saw Sean Baker eating a bag of like baby carrots or something.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
Still waiting for that. Okay, well, that's awesome. Last time you told us after your first book, you were never going to write another book. So what did you go out and do? You wrote another book, and it sounds like you might be contemplating a third or in the process. Is that something you can or want to talk about?
I mean, there's definitely contemplation. There's no actual activation of that yet. So, yeah, I do think it would be cool. My next idea was to potentially do more like a story. My first book, of course, although it has testimonies and I hope it's pretty easy to read, it is still an education-based book where I do feel like we tend to learn from stories. So more of like a fictional book, but having, weaving in the components of like metabolic health and having the individual heal with that. So, but yeah, unfortunately, my free time these days is very limited. So
sounds like it. Well, you're right about your first book, The Dietitian's Dilemma. It's one of my favorites. Despite me struggling with sentences and words and paragraphs and not just pictures, it was very simple to read, and it's one that I recommend to people. So I really appreciate you and your work. And yeah, I don't know where you ever find any free time, but to be able to come on our show today and share your knowledge with us, I love spending time with you. I love hearing all the things you're involved with, and you're definitely making a difference out there. So kudos to you. And again, thank you so very much for taking the time to be on our show. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work, Michelle?
Yeah, I just updated my website, so I'd be honored if people check that out, the dietitiansdilemma.net. On there too, it has, products I use. It's got the books. It's got a little bit about my story and about the American Diabetes Society. You can find me on Instagram at Run, Eat, Meet, Repeat, on X at Michelle Hurn RD. And then I'm casually getting onto Facebook. So if you have to track me down there, you can probably just find people are like, I'm only on Facebook and I can't find you. So like, all right, I guess, when I win the lottery, have someone else do the social media.
After that eye roll, I wasn't expecting Facebook. I was expecting like TikTok or one of the newer profiles like popping up.
Next, I do appreciate the education through all these social media. Like, it's such a love-hate relationship with social media because it's opened so many doors for me, but you just got to be careful. You can't stay on there too long.
No, especially Twitter. If I get on Twitter for too long, I just get in a really sour mood and like realize it's just been like doom scrolling totally. Totally. Michelle, again, this has been amazing. I really appreciate you and taking the time to be on our show. And you're just absolutely tireless work in our space and getting that out to people in so many different ways to the extent that you're expanding your social media networking as well. So as always, thank you so very much for our friendship, and thank you for coming on our show today. I really, really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.